These comparisons are getting a little bit tougher as I go along. Phantasy Star is an excellent RPG, and I really like that it's different from the more generic high fantasy stories that you normally see on the home console. Sweet Home is also a very good RPG, but it's a hybrid between two genres, where it's a turn-based RPG along with a survival horror game. And it also has a very different setting, so yeah, it's going to be a little weird to compare these two. Both of these games are fairly new to me. I like both of them for different reasons. They both stand out from the other RPGs on the home console, especially from like the late 1980s, with one of them being so different. This might be another case where I think one is better, but I want to go back and play the other one a little bit more just to see what it has to offer. Phantasy Star is one of those games that really shows off what the Master System can do. It looks great, the story's very fun, it's a really cool game. Sweet Home also looks great, and I love that it leans more into the horror of its source material. It's going to be pretty interesting looking at both of these. These games have a handful of similarities. Just about every RPG has some element of horror to it. There's always a little bit of fantasy and maybe some science fiction elements in there as well. What is different here is that Sweet Home is almost entirely a horror game, and Phantasy Star leans into the science fiction elements more than, horror and fantasy. This is one of those cases where one game wants to tell a grand, sweeping story, while the other one is telling a somewhat smaller story. It helps that Sweet Home is based on a movie, and the developers had to work within that existing story, so it's a little bit more focused on what it wants to do than what Phantasy Star is. Phantasy Star is going to send you on this grand, sweeping adventure across the cosmos, and Sweet Home just wants to keep you in one spot. Phantasy Star is a spacefaring adventure that starts as a revenge story and turns into something much grander. You go on an adventure, you gather your party members, and you learn just what is happening in the solar system that you're in. And eventually you end up fighting a tyrannical king, and then the evil that is kind of controlling everything that's gone wrong in the solar system. It also has some other plot points that are explored in other games as well in the series, but that is, just setting stuff up for later. Sweet Home is an adaptation of a horror movie by the same name. You control 5 characters and assemble 2 or more parties of those 5 characters. Each of them is needed to beat the game, and you have to use the tools that each of them have to solve puzzles as you go on quests in order to defeat this ghost that is haunting this mansion. You're trapped inside, you can't leave, and everything in there wants to kill you. It's pretty cool once you get into it, because you're finding all these different plot points that explain that someone else had been there before you, and you've got clues as to what's going on. It tells a very different story from what Phantasy Star is telling, but it's still a very good story. So now that we've got these admittedly simplified and vague descriptions of both games out of the way, let's get into some of the major differences between these games, and then kind of explore some of the smaller things that each one does differently. There are a number of these to go through. There's a lot of differences between these two games. The ones that I wanted to focus on are really the story, setting, and gameplay. I'll be saving the graphics and combat for later on, but let's just get through those 3 right now. The 2 stories are quite different. Phantasy Star is this big spacefaring adventure where you're exploring a solar system, learning about the history of the planets and the people that live there, and then eventually fighting a tyrannical king, and then learning about the source of all evil that is in this game's universe. Sweet Home has, admittedly, some of that in it, but it's on a much smaller scale, where everything takes place in a mansion, and you have to defeat a restless spirit who is doing evil things but isn't necessarily evil. It's one of those kind of ghost stories. Some of this carries over to the settings as well. Phantasy Star is a blend of science fiction and fantasy. It has magic and monsters as well as robots in it. Sweet Home, is somewhat grounded in reality, even though it is a horror story where you're exploring an abandoned mansion that just happens to be haunted. There is something close to magic in it. It's the whole prayer mechanic that I'll talk about in a bit. It's there, but it's not really magic in the same way that you would see in other RPGs. The gameplay is one of the biggest differences between these two games. Phantasy Star is more of a traditional RPG. You're exploring dungeons, you're grinding for levels, you're controlling a party of characters. Sweet Home, again, has some of that, but you're really managing your inventory more. You have a small inventory to hold a bunch of key items that you're going to need in order to beat the game, so you're doing a lot more inventory management. That is where a lot of the survival horror stuff comes into play, where it is an RPG, but it has all of this other stuff in it that you wouldn't normally find in one. There's also a lot of puzzle solving in this game that's more of a focus than many of the other RPGs that you would see, and you also have to manage two parties of characters. Sometimes you have to manage more than that, but it is normally just two parties of characters you need to deal with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the combat and the visuals. Those are, again, not totally different, but they are different enough to really mention. I want to try to keep this as brief as I can because I don't want to, mention a whole bunch of stuff that I've already mentioned. At first glance, the combat isn't too different. Both games are turn-based RPGs, but the magic and the combat systems are a little bit different. Sweet Home just has its prayer mechanic, which kind of acts as magic, but doesn't really. It has more uses outside of combat than it actually does inside. You can get through the game without using it all the way up until the very end. It is essential to use it when you're fighting the final boss. All of the random encounters you have, you don't really need it, or at least I didn't when I was playing it. It might have made the game a little bit easier, but I just tended to ignore that. Phantasy Star is very different from that. It has a set of both offensive and defensive magic, and you can't really call in support from the second party of characters because there is no second party in Phantasy Star. The difference in the visuals kind of bleed over into the combat as well. Phantasy Star is a bright and colorful game, and Sweet Home is a fairly dark game that matches its horror theme. In battle, Phantasy Star has more animations. Not saying that, they're drastically different, but it has more animations for its enemies than what Sweet Home does. And we're talking like a marginal difference between the two. I do have to mention the dungeons really quick. Phantasy Star's dungeons are more like a dungeon crawler. It's first-person perspective, and it's kind of annoying to move through them. Phantasy Star is kind of weird in that way. Sweet Home is something that you would traditionally see on a home console RPG where you've got a top-down view. There are probably some more things that I'm missing here, but they're not totally different from each other. You have a bunch of minor differences and then some major ones. So let's get into what each of these games does better than the other. There are a few things that I think Phantasy Star does better than Sweet Home. For one, it's a more complete RPG, because Sweet Home is kind of a hybrid of two genres. Aside from that, I just think that the graphics are a little bit better, and I kind of enjoy the gameplay more than Sweet Home's. Overall, the graphics in Phantasy Star are better than Sweet Home's. The game is showing off what the Master System can do, and I like the cutscenes more than those in Sweet Home, mostly because there are more of them, and they kind of have more of an impact than some of the stuff in Sweet Home. What you'll see in Sweet Home is more in-game graphics with a few cutscenes inserted in, like walking through doors and that sort of thing. With Phantasy Star, the comic book cutscenes kind of have more of an impact and advance the story better. The animations on the enemies, those are better, I think, in Phantasy Star. They're not bad in Sweet Home at all, and it's cool that they're there, but you get more of it in Phantasy Star than you do in Sweet Home. I'm just looking at the RPG gameplay between these two games. Then Phantasy Stars would be better. I like that each character has a defined role in combat. The magic system is much better than Sweet Home's. It is overall a better role-playing game than what Sweet Home is, but I have to add a big caveat that I'll get into when I go through what Sweet Home does better. I do like the story for Phantasy Star a little bit more than Sweet Home. I'm sure if I played that game more, I might change my mind, and it's more of a subjective thing than anything else. Really, I just like science fiction stories more than horror stories. If I thought about it, I could probably think of a few other things. Those three areas where I think Phantasy Star is better are really just a personal preference. It's a really hard comparison to make because these games are quite different in some respects. Like, they're not trying to do the same thing. So it's a little bit harder to point out certain areas that I can say this is absolutely better than the other one. It's a lot of stuff where I'm like, okay, I enjoy this more, but I can see why others might not. It's kind of a weird wishy-washy thing. Phantasy Star is more of a traditional console RPG than, what you were going to see from really a lot of the Capcom RPGs from this era, especially with what Sweet Home has to offer. But let's look at what Sweet Home does better than Phantasy Star really quick. The things that Sweet Home does better than Phantasy Star, and really every other RPG I'm going to compare it to, all has to do with how unique the game is and, just its different style of gameplay. Sweet Home does a good job of mixing up what you're going to be doing, so you don't need to really grind for levels, assuming that you're not running from the fights in the game. I usually don't run from fights in role-playing games like this, so I felt a little bit overpowered while I was going through this game at times. It also includes a lot of puzzles, and honestly a lot more than what you're going to normally see from a console RPG, so it kind of distracts you from really only having one location to explore. The game also does a good job of making you think a little bit more, as you have to manage your inventory and do more stuff that you would see in a survival horror game as opposed to a regular RPG. This makes things a little bit complicated when talking about what it does better than any other game. I do like how it does something different, and it's not just recreating the same formula you would see in other RPGs on the home console. I like having the inventory management stuff in the game and how each character feels very important to the gameplay. You don't have someone in your party that kind of feels like they're not really needed. Because you can get that in some RPGs where you have a larger group of characters and they just don't all feel necessary for completing the game. With Sweet Home, you all need to kind of work together, or at least all your characters need to work together in order to solve the problems that are in front of you. Sweet Home is a really fun and creepy horror game, and that was really how I was looking at it for most of the time that I was playing it. I can see why it wasn't brought over to North America, because a lot of its content would have had to have been cut or censored. Overall, it's a really fun game. I can keep talking about it and talking about the different things that I like, but I want to keep this moving. So let's talk about which one I think is the better RPG and which game I think I would rather play. When I look at these as role-playing games, I have to say I think Phantasy Star is the better RPG overall. This is closer than what you might think, just because both of these games have some similar elements to them, but one of them isn't trying to be a pure RPG while the other one really is. I think Phantasy Star does a better job in many of the parts of the games that are role-playing games. It has better combat, the graphics I think are better, and I do like the story a little bit more than the story in Sweet Home. From an RPG perspective, the gameplay is what you really want from a game like this. It is a science fantasy game, so you have to attack, you have healing magic, you need to use a little bit more strategy when you're fighting monsters. Both of these games only have you fighting one monster at a time, but it feels a little bit more strategic with Phantasy Star than it does with Sweet Home, mostly because Sweet Home just has you using regular attacks for the majority of the game. Both of these games have cutscenes and are fairly cinematic. Phantasy Star has better cutscenes in my opinion, and I like the way that they're used more. I also really dig the comic book cutscene style that they use. The enemies have better animations for their attacks, and I just like the way that, the combat attacks look and are done in this game. You don't have as many flashing screens in Phantasy Star as you do in Sweet Home. The stories are quite different, but I would say I enjoyed Phantasy Stars more than Sweet Home. It's a spacefaring adventure, you're exploring a solar system, it just feels really cool to fly around and visit different planets. It also has some elements of Greek mythology tossed in just for good measure. If you want a fun but challenging RPG, then Phantasy Star is a good choice. It does have more grinding than Sweet Home does, but that is kind of part of the gameplay for these older RPGs. It is easier to understand how to play this game than it is for Sweet Home. With Sweet Home, especially since you need a fan translation, if you don't speak Japanese, that is, then you're going to need to look up just what each of your controls actually does. With Phantasy Star, it's a little bit more straightforward. Sweet Home is the game that I would rather go back and play again. It's such a unique game, and I really did like the story, just not as much as Phantasy Stars. It has some gameplay mechanics that you're not going to find in any other RPG from the 1980s. I do love how the game handles its party system and how it utilizes all the playable characters effectively. Each of them has their own role in the game, and they're necessary in order to beat it, so you need to keep everybody kind of together, and you don't have one character that feels like it's just out of place or isn't necessary. I also like how you can, call the other party over in order to join the combat. It kind of cuts down on having to grind for levels and everything. It never felt like I was just stuck in one spot wandering back and forth. It always felt like I was moving forward and trying to find something different. It's a pretty fun game. I do enjoy it a lot, and I think the more I play it, the more my opinion on it will probably change, because the first time going through it, I really didn't know the controls and had to go and try to find a manual online in order to figure out what I was supposed to do. So yeah, there was that. Having to play a fan translation of this was not the ideal way of playing it, but it is the best option that you have if you don't want to go and learn Japanese. So this was about as hard as I was expecting it to be. These two games have quite a few differences between them. Phantasy Star is this big grand story where you're going to different planets and everything, and Sweet Home just has you exploring a haunted mansion and trying to escape, and then eventually trying to defeat a restless spirit that just happens to want you dead and wants to kill anybody that wanders in there. With Sweet Home, you're not necessarily fighting something evil because it is evil. You're fighting something evil because of all the things that happened to it before it became a spirit. So, yeah, it's a little bit different. With Phantasy Star, there's no twist ending where it turns out the King could have been good. Like, he's been bad the whole time, and he's being influenced by the source of all evil. So, yeah, those stories are pretty different. What I do like about both of these games is just how they feel different from the other RPGs that I played. You don't have some generic high fantasy story where you're fighting a bunch of goblins and whatnot. You're doing very different things. They also have a similar kind of art style to them where they tell their story mostly through cutscenes, and they both look really good. I enjoy the graphics in Phantasy Star a little bit more, but that's not to say that Sweet Home looks bad by any stretch of the means. So that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.